Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. By Arcuser. Chapter 1351 Piety of Beaches. Although Seth wanted to directly affirm his theory and test the new power he had discovered, he already had more than enough to do in the moment. Instead, he turned his excitement back to the fresh set of items before him. At first glance at the tenacity of Beaches, the ring with a tear-shaped monster core on it, he was able to confirm that his effort to raise durability was not in vain. The original durability was more than tripled, and it was actually more durable than some of Seth's own rings. Surprisingly, the power of the effect tenacity of Beaches had not weakened on the ring, despite splitting the original prayer bead apart. Seth had expected each set piece to inherit a weakened part of the legendary effects, and they would regain their strength as a set effect. However, the ring granted 185 strength and endurance. The additional 35 were a split from the soul's enchantment. In addition, there were the effects of the Pearl of Sai, one being Defense of Sei's Hako. The effect raised physical defense by 50% against melee damage and by 30% against ranged attacks. The other was Punch of Sei's Haku. Seth knew what to expect, but his eyes still widened when he read the description of the skill. Active skill, Punch of Sei's Haku, charge skill, no cost. I only need one punch. Charging for at least 10 seconds without moving doubles the physical damage of the next punch. Increases physical damage by 100% for every additional 30 seconds of charging, up to 10 times the physical damage. He was prepared for a good skill, but this was more than he had expected from an epic material. A 10-second charge up to double your attack power was terrifying. Taking into account that Finn was pretty good with barriers and defense, who knew how close to 10 times damage she could get in a fight. However, the actually broken part of the skill was that you didn't need to be in combat to charge up the skill. This meant wearing the ring would be like walking around with a loaded gun at all times. Any match could start off with a punch 10 times its usual power. He already felt pity for her opponents. But this was not thanks to just the Pearl of Sai. Seth knew from Sivri that this skill usually cost a shitload of mana. Apparently, only a few people used this skill past the 10-second charge, as it simply cost too much mana. Even if you could charge it outside of combat, it was not a skill anyone could comfortably use as it would constantly drain mana. If it wasn't for the soul of Pithra shouldering that cost, the skill would be far from as broken as it was. Apart from the monster skills, it also held the passive skill Brawn of Pithra, arguably also a monster skill. Brawn of Pithra strengthened all skills related to unarmed combat by 25% and added 3 points to the multipliers for physical damage and defense. It didn't sound like much, but it could stack depending on the number and kind of skills that were affected. For example, it could stack on the Punch of Sei's Haku, making that one hit deal 12.5 times the damage. Unnecessary to mention how important the multipliers were. Withstanding the urge to unfurl the set effects just yet, Seth hurriedly turned to the second ring to see what options it had inherited from the enchantments. The rings shared various options, but were fundamentally different in some ways. Piety of Beaches. Legendary Ring. Beaches Set 1/3. Durability, 1400. 1 double the power of healing skills. 2 double the power of divine skills. 3 agility of Jin's Hako. 4 plus 35 strength. 5 plus 35 endurance. 6 minor sigil of slaughter. 7 auto size. 8 passive skill, skill of Pithra. 9 active skill, jab of Sei's Hako. Beaches set effect, 3/3. Collapsed. A dereliction of a legendary item. The ring is part of a magnum opus of Master Smith, the first Master Blacksmith and Master Enchanter of Earth. Using mysterious means and elusive skills partially beyond mortal power, he has managed to reforge a legend. This ring had inherited the power of the effect of Piety of Beaches from the original prayer bead. However, unlike the tenacity, the effect had weakened this time, according to Seth's expectations, but against his recent experience. Instead of increasing the power by 150%, it only doubled it. On the other hand, the effect had split, making it clear that these two could stack to quadruple the power of divine healing spells. But why had the effect of the first ring not changed like this? Despite his curiosity, Seth checked out the other effects, which were not too different from what he expected. There was the effect and skill of the monster bead, similar to the first ring. But in this case, the specialization was a little different. While Sei's Hako were heavy hitter, the Jin's Hako were known for their speed and precision. The monster used its traits to impale its victims on its long weaponized claws. Accordingly, the agility of Jin's Hako raised the wearer's agility by 50 points and their attack speed by 30%. However, the true power of the beast was hidden in the skill granted by the ring. Active skill, Jab of Jin's Hako, 30 seconds cooldown, duration 10 seconds. Just do it. You gain 50% attack speed for the duration of the skill. You gain plus 10% armor penetration for every normal hit dealt within the duration of the skill up to 100%. Not only did the skill allow you to hit faster, but you were able to gain armor penetration up to the point that your attack ignored defense. Seth had seen Finn punch so fast that it looked like she had several fists flying. The fairy brute could probably get in several true damage hit with every use of the skill, even in those that were not strengthened by active skills. Lastly, there was skill of Pithra, which was similar in nature to Arthas 42 fire cantrips or Kager's fire magic from Seth's salamander skin. The passive skill allowed access to the skills of the soul of Pithra. Either the wearer was granted the skill at the level of the soul, or if the wearer possessed the same skill, it would add additional levels to those. It had no effect on the skills of a higher level or grade than her own, which was understandable. With this, Finn would be able to instantly gain access to all the skills the Dragon Newt monk had collected and trained during her life. She would probably take a while to get used to it, but just the passive skills were quite amazing. For example, Monk's Constitution Leave 7, added point to defense and unarmed attack multipliers. It was hard for Seth to tell whether power of Pithra or skill of Pithra. He liked both a lot, even when he couldn't really profit from the skills themselves. He was a blacksmith, his hands were his tools, not his weapons. His weapons were his weapons. Finally, excited to treat himself to a view of the set effect, Seth turned to appraise the pendant. The pendant was a little more special than the rest, since it held the core of the Hades Hiko. Unlike its relatives, it was neither specialized in physical attack nor in physical defense. The creature's relation to the other two was often argued, as it was said to have a small build and an ostentatious but soft shell. However, it was simply a different evolution. The Hades Hiko specialized in magic, covering itself in a barrier for defense and attack with a powerful magic skill. This was mirrored in the power of the pendant. Chapter 1352 Protection of Bishas. Protection of Bishas. Legendary Ring. Bishas Set. Durability, 1400. 1. Double the power of protective skills. 2. Double the power of protective spells. 3. Barrier of Hada. 4. Minor Sigil of Slaughter. 5. Auto Size. 6. Passive skill, Brains of Pithra. 7. Active skill, Void of Hada Shako. Bishas Set effect, 3/3. Collapsed. Again, it had inherited the two separate powers of protection of Bishas in a slightly weakened state. Did that mean the first ring was the outlier? Curious. As expected from the Pearl of Hada, the pendant inherited the Barrier of Hada and the active skill Void of Hada. Like the passive skill Shield Warrior's Constitution on Seth's cuirass, Sargass, this effect created a personal shield for the user and strengthened the power of barriers. Unlike Sargass' skill, which only took effect when carrying a shield and was based on the durability of the shield, Barrier of Hada was based on the base defense and HP of the wearer. It also strengthened defensive barriers by 20%. As mentioned, the Hada Shako was the result of a magical branch in the monster's evolution, and the Void of Hada was the equivalent to the punch and jab of the other two, and the reason it was apparently even more feared than the other two. Active skill, Void of Hada, no cost, 30 seconds cooldown. Create a void that causes anything in the vicinity to be crushed in a violent implosion. Range 10m. Area of effect and damage depend on the user's magic power. Although Finn had developed further in the direction of a fighter than a priest, Seth had doubts that the fairy's magic power was far from low, considering her use of barriers and buffs in battle. She was bound to surprise her allies and enemies with this. Lastly, there was Brains of Pithra, the counterpart to her brawn. Where the brawn raised the power of physical combat, this one raised the power of all magic-related skills and spells by 25%. It also added 3 points to the multipliers of magic power and mana regeneration. This came in pretty handy, together with the Void of Hada that came along with it. The various skills and effects of the individual party were already quite powerful. They brought no shame to the name of legendary items, but Seth knew that the reason the set was considered a magnum opus was hidden in the set effects, so he finally opened the drop-down menu. Bishas Set Effect, 3/3. Plus 50% power of healing skills. Plus 50% power of divine skills. Plus 50% power of protective skills. Plus 50% power of protective spells. plus 50 strength, plus 50 endurance, plus 10,000 mana. Trait, Conviction of Bishes. Trait, Draconic Monk. Passive skill, Draconic Cycle. Pithra's Path. His eyebrows jumped up in surprise when he found the numbers of the effects of the individual items were missing. So, things were as he had suspected. The separation of the item into a set had also split the effects, causing the full strength of the original to only be exerted when all pieces were worn. But what about that tenacity of Bishes? The ring clearly had its full power unless it didn't. The notification said that there had been various synergies between the materials and enchantments. The additional 50 strength and endurance were most likely a synergy between the Pearl of Sai and the tenacity of Bishes. He had not thought of that because the synergies he expected were supposed to happen in the set effects, not on individual items. Apart from the missing effects, the set effects also added 10,000 mana to the mana pool of the wearer. Considering Pithra's soul was rated X in size, that meant over 90,000 mana were preserved on upkeeping the various item and set effects. Knowing that made him excited to check the remaining ones, but that came with some surprises. Looking at Conviction of Bishes, Seth took a moment to realize that it was the synergy between Pithra and Bishes. The soul used to have the trait, Iron Will, which had been substituted by Conviction of Bishes. The trait granted a 50% immunity to mental effects, as well as raising mental power by 25%, whereas Iron Will only raised the mental resistance by 50%. It was a tremendous improvement. Similarly, the trait, Draconic Heritage has also changed. Both Bishes and Pithra were Dragon Newt monks and probably shared the trait, and their synergy had created the trait, Draconic Monk, incorporating the aura of a monk and the intimidation of a dragon. The trait had two perks. A 10% damage negation and a passive intimidation effect against hostiles. The strength of the intimidation was based on various factors, like the difference in stats, size, and condition. The stronger the intimidation against the opponent was, the higher the trait raised strength and endurance, by up to 25% of the base value. Seth had no idea how high Finn's strength and endurance were, but if he used it, he could get over 100 bonus points for each of the attributes, if he managed to make the other shit his pants. The blacksmith doubted the effect would be any worse for the fairy. Gaining even more strength against a weaker opponent was pretty good, but the true surprise was the next one. It was the set effect Seth had been looking forward to, although it was also changed by the synergy. The passive skill he expected was called Shaco Cycle, created by using 3 pearls of the 3 branches of Shaco. It mirrored their life as crustaceans. The skill could be said to grant a second life, as one would gain a shell-like barrier, with the same defense and durability as the user at the start of combat. Not only that, but the shell would also renew itself every 15 minutes and would heal the user by a small amount. However, this effect was unimpeded by the severity of the wound. So, even if it took a few cycles, one could even regenerate limbs in combat. Also, at the moment it is renewed, the wearer could opt to shed their old shell. That meant they would detonate the remains of their old shield and deal AoE damage for the shield's remaining durability. Just like a Shaco. However, the passive skill the set granted was called Draconic Cycle. Obviously, the skill was changed by a synergy with the prayer bead and the soul. However, it did not change the skill's fundamental nature, it only improved on it. As dragons were not crustaceans, they healed instead of shedding an exoskeleton, and this was not incorporated into the shield. The barrier created by the skill would heal based on the user's health regeneration, meaning there was more to detonate. The other change was that the user had the choice between detonation and healing themselves for half the remaining durability. That meant a pristine shell could heal the user by 50%, again ignoring the severity of the wounds. If the fairy ever got into a disadvantageous situation, this kind of skill could not just save her life, but even bring about an unprecedented turn. After reading over the traits and skills, he finally arrived at the last effect, Pithra's Path. Pithra's Path seemed to be the remains of her journey to become a legendary monk. She was not a legend, so Seth didn't expect anything much, however. Pithra's Path, permanent effect. No sacrifice is a loss. You gain a life essence counter. You gain 1 mark for every 25% of health you lost. You can use 1 mark to heal yourself for 2% or a target for 5%. Yep, that cemented it. Finn had next to no chance of ever dying in combat when wearing this. She would stop being a fairy brute and simply become a violent cockroach. Even if the gain of this effect seemed pitiful, ignoring the skills and power Finn already had without it, just the power of the set alone made it broken. Depending on how exactly it worked, maybe even more than he expected. Since Pithra's path was not limited to combat and didn't state it had to be 20% at once, any health Finn lost at any time could count towards the skill, meaning she could deliberately or passively stack up marks until she needed them. Seth was more than satisfied with how the set turned out, even when some of the skills seemed a little complicated, they were powerful. He actually started becoming excited when he thought of Finn's face when he gave it to her. Now he just had to prepare the moment to do it. Chapter 1353 Magic College. Pararayan, northeast of Gula. Floating above a massive hole in the ground, they faced a spire, towering above the clouds. It was not just high, but also thick, comparable to the trunk of a sapling at a tree station. They could see the shadows of clouds passing by being cast on the walls of the tower. It looked less like a building someone created and more like a menhir that someone carved a living space and windows into. The front they came up to was decorated by a giant bearded face resembling an angry wind god with his mouth ripped wide open. Said mouth was their entrance to the floating megalith. The flying vessel they had boarded at the capital entered the giant mouth, entering the massive hangar for vehicles, almost like a sky harbor or loading bay. This place was apparently the College of Magic of the Purican Empire, and the place where the Titans and Dungeon Busters were first invented and developed. After Monique's rant, the issue with the nobles and clergy ended surprisingly quickly. Even Jane admitted that the chosen of Athena and Jonah had probably been right. Although there may have been some opposition, it seemed that they had blown it out of proportion to look better. However, they had no doubt they would have been treated much worse if they had not shown their strength. At this point in time, Monique was able to confirm her suspicion. The reason there was no adventurer guild in this place, which helped manage dungeons without overwhelming losses, was the existence of an established and very hostile church. After their detention was lifted, they had spent some time at the Imperial Palace. Jane got to have her talks with the Emperor and his ministers. Monique used the time to read up a little on the Empire, as she had been curious about the lack of a guild. She had to look for a while since what she was looking for was actually just a footnote at the beginning of their dungeon crisis. When dungeons first appeared in this world, it actually did not take long for a faction like the Adventurer Guild to appear. However, they were treated like a cult. Something less known among players was that the executive people of the Adventurer Guild were not simply working there, but usually gained a blessing of the dungeon god, which allowed them to create the respawn point for players. Without the system, receiving experience in a dungeon also meant receiving power from the dungeon god. As the blessed and members were touched by a foreign god, they were treated as heretics, and the seedlings for an Adventurer Guild were stomped out by the zealots without even knowing what they were doing. The dungeon god was not a very nice god. Well, he enabled beasts and conquerors to invade other dimensions through his dungeons, for entertainment purposes. How nice could he be? After his initial goodwill was thrown away, that route was closed forever. No adventurer guild meant that dungeons were horrifying death traps that only ate up life. The only reason this world had not yet become a battlefield for the factions and beasts invading from breaking dungeons was this place, the College of Magic. Although nobody admitted to the whole spiel between the church and the nobles, it still seemed like an apology that the emperor offered them to inspect the Titan production to get an idea of their level of magic technology. This place was built by the genius Abras Tumblegate, the first and last 10th Circle Mage, who founded the College of Magic 200 years ago. He also created the fundamental technology for the Titans during his lifetime, Emissary Alton explained. Somehow, the man had become their local guide and contact for anything. She had not known what to expect. The description of it as a floating magic tower didn't really come close to the sight in front of her. Monique considered re-evaluating the power level of this world. Something like this, probably only Alzalsar could have done on Earth, considering Seth also created Python, who became a mountain-sized god, and the guardian tree, maybe the blacksmith also counted. Until now, even knights who had mastered aura, a way to use mana in martial combat, were only comparable to leave 50 players. The Titan technology raised that estimate to roughly LV 70 to 80. The Titans she had seen so far could probably be taken down by a normal party of players on that level. A LV 80 player with epic equipment could probably solo them. With some difficulty. Monique had yet to see a dungeon buster in action, but based on what she heard about them and considering that the Empire had yet to fall to the demons, they were probably comparable to that Leave 80 player she mentioned. Maybe their output also depended on the guy operating it, however. This tower was on a completely different level, and being able to create it even more so. This was comparable to a legendary feat, something she had at no point expected to see in this world, after seeing the average level. Maybe mages were different? The expedition had yet to see any mages of this world in person, much less their capability in combat. Based on how people talked about them, they also rarely took part in battles, concentrating on developing titans. The Chosen had heard that circles were the way they measured the power of a mage. If a 10th circle mage was comparable to someone close to becoming a legend, or even was a legend, then mages couldn't be weak, even if they rarely fought. The first and last? Jane asked the emissary, waking Monique from her mulling. Yes, unfortunately. There was nobody who even managed to reach the 7th circle after him. The current headmaster is one of the handful of true geniuses to reach the 6th circle, Alton explained to her. Monique's estimation plummeted back to where it was before. The founder was obviously a fluke, a rare outlier. If the 10th circle was comparable to someone close to the end of the path, then the 6th circle was barely above what could be expected from a dungeon buster. So, apart from such once-in-a-millennium geniuses and maybe juiced-up Chosen of their only god, the world's max level stayed around level 80 while the average for combat units stayed around level 50. For a moment Monique considered to ask Seth for a battalion of golems and conquer this place, if they did anything stupid again in the future. Of course, she didn't consider it seriously, but it was a fun thought to soothe her irritation. Pararian, Gula. Enjoying the sun, there were two figures seated in the imperial gardens, surrounded by well-kept rose bushes, blooming in bright red. They shared a conversation over a cup of sweet tea. Where are the foreigners now? Bishop Puffin asked the other with a benign smile and took a sip of his tea. The Emperor invited them to visit the college and observe the Titan production. It should appease them after the previous incident, the other answered calmly. Seated across the bishop was the Prime Minister of Purican. What about the demon? The bishop asked after swallowing his tea. The creature is currently at the Imperial Dungeon for interrogation, as promised to ambassadors of Minas Mar, he stated firmly. We will share the result with the church at an appropriate time, he added, when the bishop kept staring at him without saying anything. You know that isn't what we want. I want that demon, the clergyman insisted. Well, then you will have to wait until the ambassadors leave and hope they leave it in our custody. Then we might be willing to hand it over, the Prime Minister said and shrugged his shoulders. His stance was clear. The little scheme had failed, and the Imperials would act like it never existed in the first place. But what if they don't leave it in your custody? Puffin asked with a muted but sharp tone. The minister sighed. If you want it that badly, buy it. Stop throwing your authority around and try to make a proper deal. I'm sure if you offer the right thing, those foreigners will be willing to sell, he said and took his last sip of tea. That's all I have to say to you. Please don't waste my time with this topic again, he added, stood up, and left. Now alone in the garden, the bishop bit his lip, thinking of the minister's last words. He finished his tea and left soon after. Chapter 1354 College of Magic. College of Magic. Their flying ship entered the massive sky harbor through the mouth of Abra's tumble gate, who was apparently the model for the visage at the front of the floating spire. The ship was moored at one of the wharves in the massive hangar. Emissary Alton, you have arrived. Their guide was greeted as they disembarked the flying vessel. The greeter was a man wearing a dark green robe with a black scarf on top. Magicians seemed to have a universal affinity with pointy hats, except that this one wore a crumpled down version, making it look more like a cap. Professor Milton, it's nice to meet you again, Alton greeted him warmly and proceeded to introduce the party from Minas Mar, who came to visit the production facilities of Titans, as this world called their giant, monopowered mechs. Please follow me, I will show you around, Milton said, turning to Monique and the others. Taking the lead, the mage brought them further into the college, explaining the facilities and rough structure of the floating menhir. The halls didn't scale down once they left the harbor. If anything, they became even bigger. The entrance only made up a small part of the menhir's base, leaving it behind. They entered the loading bay where Titans were packaged and loaded for shipment. Clank! Careful, you idiots! Do you know how long it took to fit the armor properly? They heard an angry shout from above. Surprised, the group looked up to find that there was no ceiling. Above them was no ceiling, but a wide, brightly illuminated shaft, its upper end vanishing in white light. Nobody asked what that was for, as they came at just the right time to watch a fully assembled Titan being lowered down from it. The Titan had hit the side of the shop as it was lowered down to be placed at one of the docks for packaging. Above us is the assembly shaft. It's where Titans come to live using parts produced all across the college. That Titan was finished yesterday and is now being loaded for testing, Milton explained, noticing their gazes. The assembly shaft was also their first proper stop. As they entered a magic elevator, Milton gave them a rough explanation of the tower and its makeup. The assembly shaft was like the heart of the college, taking up most of the lower third of the whole structure. In this place, professors and students had their ateliers and workshops where they built, researched, and assembled their titans. The rest of the tower was filled with facilities for the creation and research of individual parts, dorms, and teaching facilities. He assured them that he would show most of it, except the very top, where the best experts of the tower were working on dungeon busters. The technology of the power suit-sized mechs was top secret, and not even the Emperor's request could allow outsiders to enter. I can't show you around the ateliers of the professors, but our model students agreed to welcome you into their workshop and show you around. He is in the middle of assembling his first self-engineered Titan, so I think he will be able to give you a good overview. However, it will take a while, as the student facilities are at the upper layer of the shaft, Milton warned them as they entered the elevator. He didn't lie. The elevator rose for quite a while, and Monique started suspecting they were actually skipping the whole assembly section. The moment things started to become awkward, they suddenly heard a loud crash, shaking the floating cabin that ground to a halt. Before anyone could say anything or give an explanation, the doors opened and gave a view of the mentioned workshop. Monique gasped as they had suddenly changed genre completely. The Titans may look like giant medieval knights from the outside, but the workshops they were built in looked like an automated facility or factory from Earth. The long, rectangular room was filled with all kinds of crafting stations and machines made of complicated parts that looked like a mix of steel, chromium, and crystals. The ceiling was at least 15 m high, just enough to fit in a small Titan. That explained why the elevator took so long. Oh God! Turn off already! Damn it! In every way, this looked like a slightly more arcane version of a highly advanced production facility, but something else captured everyone's attention. The giant metal fist lodged into the rock wall at one side of the workshop, still spouting a jet flame and trying to break through. It was surrounded by the remnants of an undoubtedly very expensive doohickey and a young man, desperately fiddling and hitting it in an attempt to turn it off. For a few seconds, they watched the young man do his dance around the fist, before the flame finally shut off. When the fist finally fell silent, the young man regained his situational awareness. He instantly froze like a deer in the headlights when he saw the delegation of Minas Mar, Emissary Alton, and his professors massaging the bridge of his nose, standing in the entrance of the elevator. Joshua, how often did I tell you to stop working on the jet fist? The concept was discarded for good reason. You are wasting your time and potential on this, he said, doing his best to speak in a calm and controlled manner when it was obvious that he would have loved to shout at the student. It seemed like a conversation that was held one or two too many times. I know, Professor. I'm sorry. I wanted to pack it away in preparation for the visitors, when it suddenly went off, the student explained, embarrassed. Milton could only sigh at his attitude. It's okay. I'm sorry you had to see this, but things happen in a working environment. I hope you don't hold it against him or the college, he apologized to them and the emissary. Nobody really minded, so Milton continued the tour. After the little blunder, the professor left it to Joshua to show the group around the workshop and explain his work and the project he was working on. Monique had to admit, to her who came from a more traditional background, even for Earth, and had little knowledge about magic crafting, this technology seemed quite advanced. Abra's Tumblegate had not only created this floating spire and the technology, but also the tools for the craft. According to the student, most of the machines and stations here could be operated by anyone, allowing them to process special materials and enchant components, despite not being magicians themselves. This had made the creation of titans and magic equipment a vastly more approachable profession, although it needed a high level of education, just to be able to enter the college and learn how to use these machines. But it was worth it. Apparently even a mediocre titan smith was welcomed by any high noble looking to maintain or produce their own titans. She shared a look with Jane and realized that they were thinking the same. Although their titans and dungeon busters lacked a little behind the power suits and high-level golems, the technology itself was valid and probably comparable to the advancement of Krina or Spacia. It could probably help improve their own technology. Maybe Seth had no need for it, because if they were honest, they had little idea what exactly the blacksmith was pulling off to create what he did, but Jonia Taggart and the people of Epsilon might be able to further progress with this knowledge. They knew that this whole trip was probably a sales pitch for the Titans and a show that the Purican Empire was not as weak as they may have thought, however, all it did was make them interested in the technology itself, not the titans. Maybe there was more to get out of this world than just food to overcome the shortage. Chapter 1355 As thick as his thumb. With the set of Bishas finished, all that was left for Seth was to wait for Nadal and Run to finish Mina's set. Then he could hand their new equipment to the both of them. In the meantime, Seth spent his time on planning the engagement dinner while his primary focus was supposed to return to the Sky Dragon armor. The plans and blueprints for the set had been pretty much finished during their meeting of masters. However, Seth didn't know how long exactly Nadal would need and didn't want to start on making the first set just yet. That didn't mean there was nothing he could do now. The full set was not the only thing coming from their meeting. In case someone already had legendary equipment and wouldn't be able to equip a full set, Seth saved a bunch of designs of individual pieces he could make for those. Even if they couldn't wear a full set, customized pieces would not fall behind. There were a few candidates that would be unable to don a full set like the one they were designing, Bart, the chosen of Cryas, for example, who wore the ram helmet originally made for Mike. Since the helmet of Cryas had technically become his holy armament, he wouldn't be able to wear a complete set. This was why Seth decided to take a small portion of the materials and gather some experience working with the dragon materials. He intended to make a pair of gauntlets, similar to ones proposed by Tord during the meeting. He chose to make a pair of gloves because Bart was still using the schooling gloves that Mike originally wore. That pair of gloves was designed to work together with Mike's original Flaming Fury sword, raising swordsmanship, sword damage, and magic damage cast through a sword. Although he wasn't a very proficient fighter with the sword, things were okay as long as he used the flaming sword and gloves together, but Bart had long since switched to the Axe of Ignoramus, which he had received after the Battle of Delta. His equipment was no longer fitting his skills, and he couldn't receive a full set because of his helmet. Bart was a prime example of someone who needed to get smaller sets or individual items, such as the pair of gauntlets. The base design was a shorter traditional mitten design that protected the hand in an articulated shell, instead of individual fingers. They had decided against this design for the final armor because a caster usually needed their finger for gestures. The blacksmith would forge the armor plating from the legendary dragon scales, while the gloves inside would use the relic-rated wing leather. While the scales had a better defense, the wing leather actually had a slightly higher monoconductivity. This was something Tord brought up when he suggested this design during the meeting. Not only would it enhance the transmission of magic power between the weapon and the user for skills and spells, but it could also save them some work, as it was simpler than an articulated finger. Unless the user would need to be able to articulate their hand in combat, of course. Without hesitation, Seth brought out one of the Sky Dragon heart scales and placed it on the anvil. It was about the size of a big dish with the typical shape of a scale as rough and as thick as the blacksmith's thumb. Despite the size, it was not remarkably heavy. Bringing out his trusty hammer, Seth began circulating his energy and striking the scale with Karen's obol. Although the hammer itself had the power to forge anything, he had developed the habit to also use energy circulation, 3, to quicken the process and work with more ease. Before he could start the proper forging, Seth had to prepare the material. He forged the scale into a rough square with even thickness. It resembled the way it felt when he forged his scorpion armor, but he could feel that there was a lot less resistance in the scale when he hit it, than when he forged the scales of the ancient dragon. When the square was done, Seth split it in half. There were only 20 heart scales, but using this design allowed Seth to make both gauntlets from just half a scale. Placing one half on the side for another project, the blacksmith split the remaining one in half once again. 1/4 for each gauntlet. It was a small price to pay to get to know the concrete effects and a feel of working with the material in preparation for making a whole set from it. Now that he had his materials ready, Seth could start the actual crafting process. Since the pair was not going to interact with a greater set, Seth could go wild with the enchantments he envisioned to fit Bart the best. The former Axe Warrior was the typical off-tank reliant on high attack power and moderate tankiness. Becoming the chosen of Cryas had only increased this tendency, as it raised defense and physical attack. As far as Seth knew, Bart could also gain additional buffs. He got a general power-up in Starlit Nights and various buffs depending on the visible star signs. One might think that the scales of a dragon specialized in magic were wasted on an almost purely physical warrior, but that was not necessarily true. Although Bart specialized in physical combat, it didn't mean he had no skills and powers that would benefit from the arcane buffs the Sky Dragon heart scales offered. Most importantly, the blacksmith had a way to turn it both ways. As the hammer struck the first quarter of the scale, a guttural growl filled the workshop. It was a wild and savage cacophony that had Sivri's metal plating shiver. To the beat of the hammer, metal grinding melodies rose from the forge. The bard knew just the right kind of ballad. A popular genre of demonic ballads was songs that traded physical strength for magic power. Many demons were specialized in magic, but still had very strong bodies and basic attributes. However, a mage had no need for a strong body when they relied solely on their magic. It was most popular with demons that possessed an especially strong affinity for magic. They would use items that traded their natural strength for even more magical power. Albeit smaller, there was also the contrary movement. Even demons with next to no talent in magic were born with a moderately big pool of mana and magical potential. They also had little use for these naturally given gifts. They fought with their bodies instead. As such, there also existed ballads that could trade magic power and mana for physical buffs. Either meant a trade-off between attributes, normally in the shape of a fixed debuff. This was one of those. A primitive and brutal noise, hardly eligible to be called music. It wasn't for the fact that it had your heart pumping faster as the beat hypnotized the listener into a rage-inducing trance. As one may expect, it was a ballad calling upon the grace of Andras, known for his primal rage in combat. It was one of the highest demons that granted the blessing of exchanging magical power for physical strength. Seth already had some experience with the demon god, since he had used his power on one of Mina's rings, but he was glad that he didn't attract the demon's presence this time. Similar to the demonic spirits that lost their ego and became pure concepts, the bard got a more automated response. Andras didn't have the time to listen to every iteration of these ballads. As mentioned, they were popular and used often. Although this meant that Seth had not as much freedom in tweaking and negotiating the power of the skill, it didn't mean there was none. Seth paid his last remaining common souls and the smaller ones he got at the Dragon Newt dungeon to manipulate the power and range of the demonic blessing that was slowly sinking into the dragon scale as he forged it into a big even sheet. That would weigh heavily on his soul reserve, but fortunately, Tanomol was going to return soon, so he looked forward to his source of souls to refill. Until then, he had the souls of Pithra's entourage and minions. The souls of Dragon Newts were not a bad choice for the gauntlets. They all carried the trait called Draconic Heritage. While it had fused into the trait Draconic Monk on Finn's set, the trait alone which raised the multipliers for physical damage and defense, as well as offering the effect of Draconic Intimidation. But before he could pay attention to the soul, he had to create the body. For mitten-style gauntlets, he needed various smaller plates that he would then process into articulated joints. Using the blueprint skill, Seth was able to project templates into the sheet he just forged. Using pyrokinesis to the effect of a plasma cutter, Seth cut out the rough plates for the gauntlet before bending and forging them into shape. Despite not negating as much damage, the Sky Dragon scale still took a lot of effort and time to process. It was already past lunchtime when Seth reached the point where he could test-assemble the two gloves. With that done, he decided to take a break and continue later. Chapter 1356 Divine Dexterity Pill. Returning from his meal, Seth faced the biggest hurdle of this project. Nico and Nadal were both busy, and there was no other craftsman-tier tailor here, except for him. The blacksmith had grinned his sewing skill to sewing, craftsman, leave to be able to see the effects of armors like the death set he made in cooperation with Booz. This technically made him the third best tailor of Minas Mar and meant that he would have to sew the gloves of wing leather himself. In preparation, Seth popped a pill. The Divine Dexterity Pill was one of the drugs they had bought in Spring City. Ding! The Divine Dexterity Pill has permanently raised your dexterity by 5. Ding! The Divine Dexterity Pill has temporarily raised your dexterity by 50 for 3 hours. An additional 5 points in dexterity brought his base to 450, while it was over 700 with all buffs combined. Just enough to make him comfortable in trying to process the leather to a similar degree as Nadal or Nico would. At least Seth had an advantage over other tailors. Despite being wing leather, it was the leather of a massive dragon, so it was extra thick. Normal tailors would have to use a technique called skiving, to thin the leather and make it more flexible. Like with the shadow hide, the blacksmith was able to use his trusty hammer and energy manipulation, 3, to forge out a smaller piece of leather without losing any material. He just needed to be careful not to reinforce it accidentally, which would harden it. The bard may not have been as practiced as the two masters, and he had not really done much leather work in a while, but gloves were nothing compared to the intricate mechanics he had fought with when building golems. Once again, the infernal music shook the workshop when he stretched out the leather using Karen's obel. The leather had to fit the plates, after all. Once the almost 1 centimeter thick leather was brought to a tenth of its thickness, the music fell silent again. Similar to the plates he cut from the sheet, he now cut the parts of the gloves from the piece of leather he prepared. Since they were already prepared with demonic power, the leftovers were stored for a later time. The blacksmith hesitated for a moment but ultimately brought out a spool of Puffle's sky silk. Seth had pondered for a moment whether this was the right thread for the gloves. In the past, there was not really much choice concerning what the best materials were, but now? Apart from the sky silk, they also had the Arachne silk, a legendary thread. Seth had also heard the Nico Booze, the sneaky snake, had secretly managed to get his hands on the thread Puffles had used to smolder the lich to death. After a short consideration, his hesitation vanished. The Arachne silk was durable and added agility. Puffle's silk of light probably has light damage properties. Bart had little need for either of those, although more agility was always good, but the sky silk had the more interesting effect, and it shared the sky with Sky Dragon. The sky silk was able to grant buffs depending on the weather in the sky. In that way, it was similar to the skills granted to the Chosen of Crius. Gaining buffs depending on the stars, gaining buffs depending on the situation in the sky, that sounded much more fun, although the silk effects would be rather small, compared to the robes completely made of it. The gloves were quickly finished once all materials were prepared, and he was able to marry the gloves and the plates to completely assemble the gauntlets and make sure everything fit. He corrected the armor to make everything fit properly before disassembling it again. With the glove disassembled, it was easier to enchant and engrave the pieces. As for what he wanted to engrave, the blacksmith decided to completely lean into the circumstantial buff and add the minor sigil of Mahis to the mix. Despite Mahis being a Heliopolian god, Seth didn't worry since he suspected the two pantheons to have some affinity with each other. Apart from the sigil, Seth used the remaining capacity to add a medium-strength enchantment, hiding it all within decorative engravings covering the gauntlets. Once the engravings were done, the bodies of the gauntlets were finished. Next was the soul armament. Divine buffs depending on the stars in the sky, the clouds, and the wind. Seth had decided to embrace this concept in the next step by cheating. Since he had no traditional enchantment that could do anything in this direction, what was better for cheating fate than a demonic poem? The poem he chose worshipped another demon he had already had some experience with. Furfa the storm demon, whose most prominent effects could be seen on the staff Storm of Death, was able to raise violent winds and thunderstorms. Translating it from demon tongue would have been hard, a task for a better linguist than Seth. It was written in a first-person perspective specific to the demon language. The best translation the blacksmith could come up with was something like, "I shall recline and watch my glory rise. My own herald, I am not, for I don't need an introduction. My approach will stay unnoticed until it is too late. I shall recline and watch my glory ascend. My call is thunder, and lightning. My being is something very frightening. My name is Furfur, exterminating. You are unconvinced? My call is unyielding, and raging. A clash of elements that gives birth to chaos. My name is Furfur, dominating. If you are unconvinced I shall demonstrate." Much of the original flow and excitement was lost in translation, but it held the rough meaning of the demonic runes Seth intended to etch into the soul. What soul? Seth had already thrown the dragon newt souls he had harvested on his last adventure into the soul refinery. Usually, Seth used the soul refinery to upgrade a whole lot of mediocre souls with specific traits into one big soul that would hold a better, refined version of that trait. Or to get rid of parts and traits that could weaken or get in the way of the final piece. But since all of the dragon newt souls were hand-plucked by the spirit blacksmith himself and not just some drags he picked up, it would have been a shame to just churn them into one big streamlined soul for Bart alone, discarding the other useful parts that were not in favor of the item. That was why Seth didn't do that. Instead, he used the refinery to fuse, split, and refine the various souls he got into 5 massive ones, that each held components of similar nature, as well as the draconic heritage trait. The one he made for Bart was Soul of the Draconic Body, Epic, Massive, Crafting Material. An artificially made soul created through mysterious means, offering the essence of draconic body strengthening. Trait, Draconic Heritage. The description didn't say much, but it was essentially the amalgamation of physical enhancement skills the dragon newts knew and mastered during their life. It held loads of passive skills for Bart. Now, Seth just had to forge the soul into an exact replica of the gauntlets and etch the poem onto them. It was close to evening when he was finally able to place the gauntlets into the waters of Styx and heard the all-too-familiar notification that he had finished a legendary item. Chapter 1357 The car. I'm sorry, Seth. It will take at least another day, I think, Nadal informed him. Seth came by the tailor workshop in the morning of the next day to ask when Mina's set was going to be finished. The blacksmith clicked his tongue, hearing the answer. This meant there was another day of walking on eggshells, so he wouldn't accidentally reveal his secret. As much as he would have liked to spend the day with Finn and Mina, he was afraid of his loose tongue. After finishing the climatic gloves, a name he had given the gauntlets, there wasn't much he could currently do. He couldn't assemble the masters to finish the dragon armor blueprint, as run was needed here, and for similar reasons to why he didn't want to be around Finn and Mina. I see, thank you for your hard work. If you need anything, please ask Tord. I will be leaving Minas Mar for a day, the blacksmith announced. Since he was afraid to blurt out the secret when staying in Minas Mar, he just had to leave. The Bard would make a trip to TS12, the station in Y-City where Bart and Baker were staying. It wasn't Little Epsilon, for the simple reason that TS8 TS12 were all within the region of the Fallen District, so its name stayed TS12, despite a rise in populace. He already had the perfect excuse for the journey. And I'm supposed to believe that? Is that really the reason? Mary asked suspiciously. Seth just came by to inform her of his absence, but he was suddenly doubted. I will deliver the gauntlets for Bart and explain their power, and get an update from Baker concerning his newest project. It doesn't really matter what you think, there is no other reason at all, the blacksmith insisted. Baker had started what he had pitched to Seth during his stay at Spring City. With Bart in TS12, they had already started reclaiming the local subways and moved toward the train connections between Epsilon and Delta. I'm just saying, if there is something I should know, please tell me. Don't you usually hate traveling? You usually only leave when you go on vacation or need souls, Mary asked, worry in her voice. Mary was genuinely concerned to suddenly see the shut-in going on an unnecessary trip. They could just call Baker for an update, and Bart could come to Delta just as easily as Seth could go to TS12. Seth thought for a moment before approaching her. Fine, listen. I'm preparing a surprise and am trying to get out so I don't tell anyone by accident, the blacksmith whispered. You just told me, though. I only told you that there is one, not what it is. That's the reason I'm leaving, so stop worrying. I'm off, the blacksmith gave a quick explanation and was on his way. Fortunately, the way to TS12 was as easy as traveling to Spring City. Thanks to the System Church, now staffed by their own local congregation trained by Simon, having a branch in every tree station, Seth could directly teleport from Minas Mar to the one in Y-City. Name, the priest guarding the teleport hub asked bored, ready to write the name down. He had not recognized the Tower Master. Probably because he had yet to look up. Seth Smith, I'm here on a spontaneous business trip, the Bard said calmly. Despite having a few public appearances, it was not common for him to be recognized in public, unless of course. Seth Smith, he asked quickly and looked up, observing Seth's face diligently. The Tower Master of Minas Mar? But nobody warned me that we were getting an important visitor today, the priest mumbled in shock, suddenly remembering his rather lackadaisical work ethic a moment ago. As I mentioned, the visit is spontaneous. I have to meet the chosen of Cryas, and it would be a good idea to inform Baker that I'm here now, the Bard suggested with a smile. It's already too late for that, a voice interrupted their conversation. Looking at the entrance of the teleport hub, they found Mark Baker already standing there. His breathing was irregular, and his suit was slightly ruffled, but he did his best to hide that he had come running here. Lady Mary called me a little early and informed me of your surprise visit, the mayor of TS12 said, correcting his clothing. It's not a surprise if you were informed. At best, it is on short notice, the Bard argued. 5 minutes is very short. Baker mumbled but didn't seem like he wanted to keep talking about that. I guess Mary told you why I'm here? Seth asked. Since the administrative head of Minas Mar called him, she would have at least explained why he came here. Yes, she told me. I called for Bart, but he is currently on a mission, raiding a dungeon outside the city, Baker mentioned as he invited Seth to follow him to a more private setting. Seth followed, but continued talking as they walked. I guess it will take a while for Bart to come back, then you can give me an update on your progress here, the blacksmith suggested. He thought it would probably take an hour or two to talk about their progress on cleaning the train tracks, and then he could simply spend his day in the station, waiting for Bart's return. Oh, I actually intended to show you, on the way to meet Bart, Mark said with a bright smile. Seth was unable to see any cheekiness in his expression, but he felt like he could hear it. Baker was trying to pull a prank on him, but the blacksmith had no idea what he was trying to accomplish. We are going to meet Bart? Does that mean the tracks? Yes, up to the dungeon Bart is currently raiding, we have already managed to free, repair, and fortify the connection. It's also a chance to give you a taste of our new train cars, which we developed for the travel between stations, the mayor said excitedly. Following Baker, they didn't stop at an office to talk, but went directly down the new subway station of TS12, which connected to Y-City's underground and the main lines leading to other districts. Baker was right, this was actually the first time for Seth to get a look at the new trains the technicians of Ypsilon had developed. In shape, the new design seemed more rounded, but in size, they were no different from the standard train cars. After all, why would they? It was a tried and true standard. But that was already where the similarities ended. These cars were automobiles and didn't need a tank engine to pull them. This was where the more roundish design came into play. Where a normal train had rows of wheels at the bottom, this one had 8 rails of light protruding from the body. One under it, one on its roof, one on the left side, one on the right, and one for each corner of the round car. It was a design perfectly adapted for propelling this tampon-shaped train through a tube-shaped tunnel. Using hoverpad magic, we developed a new kind of low-friction propulsion, similar to a maglev train, Baker stated proudly when he saw Seth's look. But it is not confined to tubes. As long as 2 rails come close to a surface, it can drive perfectly fine, wherever it is. Albeit a little slower, the mayor explained as they entered the train car. The inside was decorated with high-quality furnishings, like a VIP section. There were 3 rows of windows, left, right, and on the ceiling. If the car is made to turn and tumble, won't the people? Seth asked curiously. If the car could drive, no matter which side was up and down, what would happen to the people sitting inside? You don't have to worry about that. The passenger cabin is actually suspended within the car, using a magic force field. This way, the only effect of the car's rotation is that you will see the windows moving, Baker answered. You will get so experience it soon. Chapter 1358 Speed-only aircraft could compare. The fusion of technology and magic shot through the repossessed subway tunnel and entered the track leading through the parks and forests once maintained between Y-City and its satellite cities. Wild vegetation had been cut back, monster damages were recovered. Seth swallowed a little. In the tunnels, he had no indication of how fast they moved. Looking through the 3 big window fronts, the blacksmith was now able to see the landscape zoom past. Nothing close by even stayed long enough in view to recognize what it was. Unless he used the power of Thai's vision, Seth would have been unable to see anything but the green smudges of trees and bushes. Despite obviously traveling at a speed only aircraft could compare to, Seth felt nothing. Surprised what science and magic can accomplish? We have created a vacuum tube along the track, using barrier technology. Together with the low-friction hover rails, this train car is even faster than our original bullet trains, Baker explained proudly. Faster than which ones? Seth asked for details. Back in the day, there was a range of speeds that bullet trains could reach, from 500 up to even 1000 km per hour. On these straight lines, we average at 1000 km per hour, a little lower if we have to follow curves, the proud dad bragged about his baby. It would have been a lie if he said that he wasn't impressed. If the tracks were freed and optimized, someone would be able to travel from Y-City to Delta in 3 to 4 hours. It couldn't compare to the convenience of teleportation, but it was probably more affordable. Not everyone could just zoom back and forth between cities, using the Minas Palin or Dingsbumbern. Either it was incredibly expensive to pay for the energy spent, or Orihumas had to take the risky teleport offered by the system church. In the distance, Seth could see the ruins of fallen satellite cities, and the view was as fascinating as it was horrible. Sitting in a comfortable seat, he stared outside, forlorn thoughts invading his mind. Baker stayed silent, leaving the bard to enjoy the show. The ride was everything Mark Baker promised. Fast, silent, comfortable, unfortunately short. It took barely 15 minutes for the high-speed vehicle to reach their destination, an ridge of smaller foothills of the central mountain range, reaching into Ypsilon. In front of them, he was able to watch the mountains quickly approaching, thanks to the almost 360 degrees view. With a slight shake, the train car entered the tunnel and decelerated to a halt within a couple of seconds. The bard was almost disappointed that it ended this quickly. The sides of the train car opened, giving way to a station currently under construction. Craftsmen like masons and architects, and technicians were busy reconstructing the pre-existing structure. Seth even found some unfamiliar, yet very dwarf-like faces. As he watched them work, a memory surfaced from somewhere in the back of his mind. Small of stature with a wide build and beard similar to dwarves, but with greyish skin and hair. Were these members of the Grey Dwarves, Xiong Peng's granddaughter had befriended in the northern mountain range? Seth knew that they had made somewhat of a contact with them back then, but he didn't know it was to the point that they would be working here. Bart is currently clearing the dungeons that have infested and connected the track leading through the southern ridge of Ypsilon. I already sent a message for him to come meet us here, Baker informed him, but Seth only perceived him peripherally. Are those Grey Dwarves? He asked the mayor of Y City. You recognize them? Yeah, we managed to make a connection with them during a diplomatic ball in Delta, Baker explained. Right, Seth heard about those once in a while, but it was not something he was interested in. He rather sat at home with the girls, or worked in the workshop, than go to those stiff events. I heard of them. Are they good craftsmen? The blacksmith asked the important questions. In general, they are better than us, when it comes to traditional things, but they can't compare when it comes to engineering or knowledge. Compared to normal dwarves, I think they have a higher talent for magic, Baker gave a probably honest assessment. Tower Master? What are you doing here? They were interrupted by a voice. Seth was slightly intrigued by the Grey Dwarves, but his original business here had just shown up. The Chosen of Cryas, still wearing the ram helmet, was walking up to them from further down the tunnel. Bart, there you are. Get in the car, I have something to give you. Seth immediately decided to occupy the first comfortable and private place that came to mind. But what about inspecting our progress? Mark asked, surprised and a little lost. Afterward, the blacksmith said, waiting for Bart to walk up to them. When he arrived at the car, the two men got into the train car, locking Mark Baker out of his own prototype. Bart sat down opposite him and took off his helmet. So? What exactly is the reason for suddenly coming all the way here and calling me for a meeting? The former outlaw leader asked, as he fell back into the well-cushioned seats. He was rough, but not stupid. I was bored and made you a legendary dragon item, the blacksmith threw out there. Bart burst out laughing. Your jokes are really something. Why would I be the first to get one of those items? Like I said, I needed something to do, and coming up with an idea for an item for you was not hard, Seth said, shrugging his shoulders. You mean, this is true? The Chosen of Cryas asked in disbelief. As an answer, Seth placed the climatic gloves on the small table between them. The midden-style gauntlets shone in a greyish blue, like a sky filled with dark clouds. Bart's eyes widened in shock at the sudden answer. Climatic gauntlets. Legendary. Climatic set 1/2. Physical DEF, 2000. Mag, Def, 2000. 1 negate 60% magic damage. 2 negate 40% physical damage. 3 Sky Dragon Magic. 4 Sky Support. 5 Trait, Dragon Heritage. 6 Weather Support. 7 + 75 Strength. 8 Passive Skill, Dragon Body. Set Effect. Passive Skill, Climatic Constitution. Active Skill, Berserker's Deal. Active Skill, Storm Wrangler. Active Skill, Lightning Strike. One of 2 gauntlets forged by Master Smith, the first Master Blacksmith and Master Enchanter of Earth. Hands to grasp the weather itself, created through mysterious and demonic means. It was the first item made of the Sky Dragon materials and the first time the effect of the heart scales had been displayed in fixed numbers. The first 3 effects belonged to the material and came as some surprise to the blacksmith. Whoa, what does it do? Bart asked, mesmerized by the legendary item. It was a shame that only a special appraiser skill, or expensive appraisal scrolls, were able to make the functions of items visible to anyone. Whether one wanted this or not was another question. Still, Seth didn't actually mind the chance to brag about the item he had created. Of course, he had also written it all down, so Bart could read up on it later, but for now, the blacksmith went over the item's effects for Bart. So, there is the expected damage negation, the blacksmith started off. Seth had estimated a roughly 50% damage negation, but it was actually split into 60% for magical and 40% for physical damage. It actually negates 50% of any incoming damage? No matter how great the damage is? Bart asked excitedly. Well, if you average it out, yet. That's why it is legendary. But there is also a secondary effect of the material, the blacksmith continued, talking about the sky dragon magic, the third effect specific to the dragon species. This was something Seth's scales had lost due to age and the decay caused by the dragon's curse. The effect granted 1000 mana, lowered spell costs by 15%, and increased magic damage by 50%. These didn't seem like much in the legendary scheme of things, but this effect actually stacked with every piece worn. So, Bart wearing 2 gloves that meant plus 2000 mana, more than doubling magic damage, and roughly 25% less spell costs. Just imagining what this effect could do in a full armor set made Seth excited. Especially since they designed the Sky Dragon armor in a way that would optimize this power. Mages being able to keep firing high-cost spells, with tremendously increased power and lower cost, was a frightening thought for their enemies. Yet, Bart seemed unconvinced by the draconic power. Chapter 1359 Minor Sigil of Mahis. Hearing about the magic buff of the dragon scale, Bart seemed a little conflicted but ultimately spoke up, stating the obvious. That sounds great, but I'm not really using a lot of spells, Bart brought up. Don't worry, I thought of that. We are getting to that part later, the blacksmith assured him. First, he wanted to make sure Bart understood the basic effects of the gloves. Some effects like plus 50 strength didn't need much explanation, but things got a little harder when the blacksmith finally came to sky support and weather support, 2 of the main reasons he called these gauntlets the climatic gloves. These play a little into the nature of your skills. Since you can gain buffs depending on the stars, I thought these would be quite fitting, the blacksmith explained as he spoke about the 2 effects. Sky support was most likely generated from the synergy between the sky silk of Puffled and the sky dragon leather. Overall, the effect was comparable to the power of Seth's sky robe, but only roughly 15% of its effects. Under an open sky, the item defense would increase by 30%, while the wearer would gain plus 15 to all attributes, plus 10% additional defense against light/fire/water/ice attribute damage, as well as a 20% increase in resource regeneration and an additional 30% spell damage. All of that doubled, because he wore 2 gloves. This is great, but it does nothing indoors, does it? Bart asked hesitantly. That is correct, in your current situation, when you are mostly running around subterranean dungeons, this won't be of much help, but it's not like you will do this forever. The battle on the continent will mostly happen in the open. It will be of great help then. In the meantime, the blacksmith said and turned Bart's attention to the last individual effect of the gloves. Seth suspected that the minor sigil of Mahis had turned into weather support, maybe due to a synergy with the dragon materials or the sky silk. As the name suggests, it gave buffs depending on the weather in the sky. Seth had written down the most important points. Wind, plus 20 agility plus 10% movement speed. Clouds, plus 20 endurance plus 10% phys defense. Rain, plus 20 intelligence plus 10% mag damage. Snow, plus 20 willpower plus 10% mag defense. Sunshine, plus 20 strength plus 10% phys damage. Mist, plus 20 dexterity plus 10% attack speed. Hail, plus 10% mental defense. Storm, plus 10% to all stats. This one works even if you are indoors or underground, as long as the weather is raging above and the effects stack for each weather phenomenon happening, Seth explained. This effect was the reason why Seth had chosen Furfur for the enchantment of the soul. The power of the demon and this effect had a good synergy. Bart exhaled, excited again. The individual effects were okay, but seeing as they could all stack together in chaotic weather, the result could become quite powerful. Less so because of the additional attribute and more so because of the additional percentage in stats. Having regained Bart's interest, Seth turned to explain the set effects. This time, these were almost purely made up of skills and a single trait. The trait Dragon Heritage was a higher version of Draconic Heritage and probably the result of a synergy between the soul and the dragon scales. Fortunately, the effects didn't veer too far from the original trait. The rise in defense multipliers had doubled, and it now also increased the mana multiplier slightly, meaning Bart would have even more mana. The blacksmith guessed that the intimidation effect would also be higher. It played well together with the passive skill, Dragon Body. This skill was the culmination of all the passive skills of the Dragon Newt Souls he had refined. It could actually be toggles, having an active and a passive effect. The passive effect raised all base defenses by 30%, the health regeneration by 15%, and improved all physical attributes by 50 points. When activated, it lowered all attributes by 200 but doubled defense and physical attack power. "Oh, I like that one," Bart commented on the skill. "I knew you would," the bard commented. The second passive skill from the set effects would be Climatic Constitution, which is actually a little different from Weather Support, Ste continued. Passive skill, Climatic Constitution, no cost. Allows the user to recover using the power of the elements when in contact with climatic conditions. The user is less affected by weather conditions. Seth didn't quite know where this skill came from, his best guess was that various elements had synergized to create it. It's a kind of recovery skill. I wasn't able to properly test it yet, but from what I saw, it is similar to having an affection with weather, I guess. You can recover mana, health, stamina, mental power, or other resources depending on what weather you are exposed to, the blacksmith gave his best estimate. I see, it definitely goes well with the weather support, the chosen of Cryas mused. Yeah, and wait until you heard about the next skill. Storm Wrangler allows you to manipulate the weather, the blacksmith revealed, satisfied with the look Bart suddenly gave him. Until now, everything seemed like the power of the gloves was dependent on outward influences, but this skill changed that. Active skill, Storm Wrangler, mana cost, channel. User casts magic to throw the heavens into tumult or calm the raging elements. The descriptions didn't say much, but Seth had already tested it out. This was the power of Furfur granted to the gloves. Storm Wrangler was a magic skill that worked like a spell and could turn clear skies into raging storms, or raging storms into clear skies. Its power and area of effect depended on the user's magic power and the mana spent. Most importantly, the skill was also affected by the Sky Dragon magic, making it that much more usable. Counting in the climatic constitution, Bart would be able to summon and withstand storms that could blow away his enemies. The second skill granted by Furfur and maybe a synergy was the lightning strike. Literally, an unarmed punch loaded with an electric charge that would hit the opponent like a lightning bolt. Lastly, is the skill that will really make these work for you, Berserker's Deal. It allows you to trade magical power for physical power. You can lower your mana and the power of your spells in exchange for increasing your physical damage and attributes. So I can trade in all the magical improvements the gloves give me and gain that much more physical strength in battle. Bart asked doubtfully. The bard didn't blame him for not immediately believing it. Well, they say practice over theory. Maybe you should just try it out. The blacksmith suggested that Bart take it for a spin to experience the power of a demonic deal. But you will have to excuse me, since I finished my business here. It's up to you to make use of it, now, the blacksmith added. The train car was comfy and cool and all, but Seth didn't feel like waiting around for Bart to return with his review. After all, he was in the middle of clearing the road for the project. Oh, yes. Of course. Thank you so much. Bart thanked him, slightly embarrassed. Are you two done already? Baker stuck his head through the door after Bart gave his thanks and said his farewells. Yup, let's drive back, a little slower this time. Chapter 1360 Somewhere Else, 35. Mar. Listen here, you little shit. We have a deal, and if you don't abide, I will have your soul and all your inventory. Do you understand me? Ten Mole barked into the communication crystal. He had just returned only to find remnants of his business remaining. Now the demon was busy reining in the disloyal bunch of business partners that had tried to pull clear of him during his absence. Sandra had already apologized profusely, but he didn't even blame her. He should have known those scum would try to use his leave. No, buddy, it's nothing personal. Bragmomal, the meager voice of the worm came from the crystal ball and only served to make him angrier. This slimy, spineless son of a snail witch. You will send me what you owe. I don't give two shits about Bragmomal. If you dare, try and tell him where I am, but you better hope he does his job thoroughly. Because if he doesn't, you will learn of a fate worse than your being captured, the goat gave a sinister promise. I will send the merchandise within the hour, the defeated business partner gave in, facing the burning gaze of the goat demon. Good. The conversation ended with Tunomole cutting off the connection. How long was he gone for? Not even half a year, and these wimps had quickly tried to cut ties with him. Bragmomal, that dogged bull, was starting to become a problem. Even if he couldn't touch him as long as he stayed in Mar's territory, he was bad for what little business he was able to sustain. He had to get rid of WebNovel, or redirect his aim. Maybe Seth would be open to helping him out with that. East of Beta, southeast of Y City. The vast sea of trees was surging below them in the light of a new day. They had passed the mountains and a short stretch across the ocean south of Y City to reach the shores covered in greenery. "We are here," Allison exclaimed from the cockpit of the shuttle. After leaving Beta and traveling southeast for a day, they had finally reached the massive forest, Seth's very nightmare. Their mission was finally back on track. "Are we going down right here?" Lixis asked from the cabin in the back. The light in her eyes betrayed her smidgen of elven blood. Despite hearing from Seth about the terror of these woods, she seemed undeterred in her belief in their beauty. No, we definitely aren't." Jess spoke up, very much convinced by the blacksmith's cautionary tales. Their team was made up of fire devils for a reason. Apart from Allison, who could cast any spell as a wizard, their team was specialized in fighting the botany. Allison and Evie were here for their expertise as alchemists. Lixis and especially Jess had expertise in casting fire magic, or elemental fire. Edward wielded fire using the legendary White Hilt. Then there were James and Bulko. One grew stronger in fire, especially in Jess's fire, and the other took the role of their cleric. They were perfectly equipped to plunder and pillage the forest for its resources and strike it down in case it tried to defend itself. "Then what are we doing?" Lixis asked, a little confused by Jess' vehemence. "We are setting up camp at the foothills," Evie said as if it were a matter of fact. The ever-growing forest had few weaknesses, but the cold and a lack of nutrients were two of them. Despite magically growing at great speed, it didn't seem like the trees could grow with magic alone. The unstoppable green ocean broke at the slightly higher altitudes of the central mountain range. "That's where we will set up camp," Allison said, pointing at the horizon to their left. The shuttle flew some distance north until it reached a ridge that towered over the massive trees of the southeastern forests, then the vessel slowly landed on the bare rock. Cold wind blew in their faces as they unboarded the shuttle and looked down at the vast forest that had swallowed a great part of Earth. They all took a moment to enjoy the feeling of fresh air and finally stood back on solid ground after being stuck in the shuttle for over a day. "We will take care of the camp, you can start scouting, Evie," Allison suggested to the witch with a pat on the shoulder. She was not just here as the immortal witch, but also as the chosen of Persephone. With her huge army of undead, she was the main source of manpower, and the reason they didn't come with a bigger team. "All right, have fun," the necromancer said and sat on the ground with crossed legs. The buttocks didn't touch the ground for long, as she started to gently hover above the ground. Small gate opened, releasing small and medium-sized undead, created from dead beasts, from her personal Hades. Instead of going inside themselves, the undead would scout the area and report back if they found anything of interest. Since they were Evie's undead, they shared her rudimentary knowledge. She was also able to remotely control them and share their senses. With the witch taking care of general scouting and collection, the team only needed to enter the dangerous vegetation, in case the harvesting had to be done personally, or a potential danger stopped the undead from successfully collecting them. "All right, guys, you had enough time to practice. Let's set up the tents," Allison instructed them. Of course, they didn't bring any old tents here. They were the elite of Mina's March. They conducted outdoor missions with style. The tents were a product of Grant May and technically set themselves up. The only thing the team had to do was arrange their furniture inside the miniature house, which had a slightly larger space on the inside than it looked like from the outside. They didn't have to miss anything, even when going on a field trip. "How long are we staying again?" Bulko asked Allison after the tents were mostly arranged. They had lost a lot of time because of the business in THRES, which meant they were behind schedule. "No matter how often you ask, you will get the same answer. As long as we can and at least as long as we need to," the alchemist repeated the answer she had already given him at another time. Allison doubted it would be hard to get the seed for the ever-growing trees. Worst case, they could simply stuff a whole tree in their inventory. That would probably be enough for Karina to work with. The problem was their other two objectives. The quest to research the potential herbs and ingredients for alchemy in the forest was an open-ended mission. It probably wouldn't even end if they managed to map out the whole forest. However, compared to that, the quest to get the seed of an original hanging tree was the truly dangerous part of their mission here. They had all heard Seth's horror story. The blacksmith had told them about his survival story in preparation for the mission. Even if a hanging tree wasn't as big as the guardian tree was now, it was bigger than the ordinary sapling at the tree stations, which was massive. Taking into account the havoc the allied trees could wreak, she really didn't look forward to finding a wild hanging tree. They didn't even know whether those had seeds. According to Simon's information, hanging tree was actually a phenomenon occurring when within large batches of the ever-growing forest. Like a sudden mutation because of proximity, or the rise of a king above a bunch of vassals and underlings. If a normal tree simply turned into a hanging tree because of certain circumstances, then the best they could do was bring a wood sample back for Karina. Allison was just glad that this wouldn't happen anytime soon. After all, a hanging tree would stick out like a sore thumb from the green sea. It would not sneak up on them.